Those of you who knew Joyce remember how she used to love a good story. That probably explains that little tendency of hers to tell you the same story more than once. Well, Joyce told me at least a couple of times that when she and her brother Bart were kids, and they were told a story about giants, or read one for themselves when they became old enough, they would react in one of two ways. If the story was about a nice giant who was kind to children, at least by the end, Joyce said that they would picture their mother's cousin Breezy, who was more distantly related to my father. Breezy was good-natured, well, he was good-hearted, but not quite the sharpest arrow in the quiver, so to speak. On the other hand, if the story was about giants who were gruff and mean, especially to kids, like the giant who meets Jack at the top of the beanstalk, they would think of a different relative entirely, their paternal grandfather. Bart says that they called him Old Mr. Allen, but Joyce used to refer to him simply as Mr. when she talked about him. Judging from some of the stories I've heard about him, he sounds like one of those people who are difficult to get along with at the best of times. Speaking of giants, the Anglo-Irish author Oscar Wilde, who lived in the Victorian era of the late 19th century, once wrote a short story about a giant whom Joyce would have described as starting out more like Mr. than like Cousin Breezy. Called The Selfish Giant, the story was first published in 1888, and it goes something like this. The selfish giant owns a beautiful garden surrounding his castle, and the garden has beautiful soft grass, 12 peach trees, lovely fragrant flowers, and the local children love to play there after school. When the giant returns after visiting his friend the Cornish ogre for 7 years, he takes offense at the presence in his garden of all these children he doesn't know, and builds a high wall to keep them out. He puts up a notice board which reads, "Trespassers will be prosecuted." The children try playing in the road, but the road is dusty and full of hard stones, and they don't like it there. And they sigh wistfully for the garden from which they've been cast out. Winter comes and then goes, and then spring arrives and blesses the whole country round about, except for the giant's garden, which is passed by. The birds won't go there and sing because they, and indeed all of nature, are on the children's side. So the trees forget to blossom and the flowers won't bloom. The one flower that raises its head briefly above the ground sees the notice board and then hunkers down and goes back to sleep because it too feels sorry for the children. Summer bypasses the garden as well, and when the time comes, Autumn won't bless the garden with golden fruit because of her opinion of the giant. He is too selfish. Only the snow and the frost are pleased at the perpetual winter in the garden. The snow spreads her cloak all around the garden, and the frost uses his brush to paint all the trees silver. Then they invite their friend the north wind to join them, and he runs around the garden howling. Finally, they invite the hail, and he clatters on the castle roof and breaks most of the slates. The giant, whom Wilde describes as somewhat limited in his conversation, is left to wonder why spring is so late in coming. One morning, as the giant is lying awake in bed, he hears the song of a bird, a linnet to be specific, and he looks out the window. The children have found a gap in his wall and crept back into the garden, accompanied by the spring, except for one tree in the farthest corner of the garden. There it is still winter. A small boy under the tree is crying because he can't climb the tree, which is doing its best to help the child, but all to no avail. The giant's heart goes out to the little boy, and he regrets his former selfishness. He slips quietly down the stairs and goes out to help, but the other children become afraid and run out of the garden and take Spring with them. The little boy under the tree doesn't see the giant because he's crying too hard, and the giant comes up behind him and lifts him into the tree. On impulse, the boy puts his arms around the giant's neck and kisses him. The other children come back into the garden when they see that the giant is no longer wicked, while on his part, the giant spends the rest of the day breaking down the wall and then playing with the children, telling them that it is their garden now. When the children have to go home for the evening, the little boy whom the giant had lifted into the tree is gone. The other children don't know him, never having seen him before, and so they can't pass along the giant's message to be sure and come back to the garden with them the next day. The giant is fondest of this boy because he had kissed the giant after he was lifted into the tree. Years go by. The giant grows old. When he becomes too weak to play with the children himself, he sits and watches them play in the garden, and often remarks that his garden has many beautiful flowers, but the children are the most beautiful flowers of all. But the first little boy, the giant's favorite, is never seen again. One winter morning, the giant is getting dressed when he looks out the window and sees the boy he had helped standing under the tree in the farthest corner of the garden, which is covered in lovely white blossoms. The tree's branches are all golden with silver fruit hanging down from each branch. The giant runs downstairs in great joy and goes out into the garden. But when he draws near the child, the giant's face grows red with anger at what he sees. The palms of the boy's hands have the prints of 2 nails, as do the child's feet. "Who hath dared to wound thee?" thunders the giant. "Who hath dared to wound thee? Tell me that I may take my big sword and slay him." "Nay," says the child, "these are the wounds of love." "Who art thou?" asks the giant, and he kneels in awe in front of the child, who smiles at him. "You let me play once in your garden," says the child. "Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." And when the children run in that afternoon, they find the giant lying dead under the tree, and he's all covered with white blossoms. The reason that I retold this story is that the giants in our fairy tales are, of course, stand-ins for our parents and the other adults we have to deal with during our childhoods. The selfish giant is clearly allegorical. After all, we all knew who the child is by the time the giant sees the nail marks in his hands and feet. Some people try to allegorize the giant as being God as depicted in the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, if you prefer, which would explain the children's expulsion from the garden. But since the giant is explicitly referred to as wicked, it is probably better to see him as representing ourselves, with our worst traits being transformed by our interaction with Christ. Now, the point about the giants in our fairy tales reflecting our parents and the adults we have to deal with during our childhoods is also true about our personal image of God. The Bible refers to God using a number of what I like to call relational metaphors. God is king. God is judge. God is shepherd. God is husband and Israel is God's cheating wife. God gives birth to Israel. And even God is Israel's breastfeeding mother. These are found throughout the Hebrew Bible, or the Christian Old Testament. But in the New Testament, the dominant metaphor for God is, of course, God as Father. This seems to have been Jesus' favorite way of thinking about God, and it has come down into Christianity from him. The metaphor of God as Father first appears in the Bible at Exodus 4:22, where the Lord instructs Moses to tell Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay your firstborn son." However, that reference is probably from centuries after the time in which it is set. In fact, there's a very good chance that this concept of God as Father first appears in Israel during the reign of King David. It's told in 2 Samuel 7. David has successfully transferred the Ark of the Covenant to his new capital at Jerusalem, and he mentions his plan to build a temple worthy of God to Nathan the prophet. And we have no idea where Nathan the prophet comes from or any of his history, because he just suddenly appears in the text. Nathan tells the king to do what is in his heart because the Lord is with him. But that same night, the word of the Lord comes to Nathan. God asks David when any of the previous leaders of Israel have ever been reproached for not building God a house of cedar wood. Instead, God will build David a house, that is a dynasty. And of course, there's a pun between the house as a physical structure and the house as a family line. And then God has this to say. This is 2 Samuel 7, 12 to 15. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. When he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the Son of Men. But I will not take my steadfast love, my chesed, from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. So God will be a father to David's son, who will be a son to God. And God will establish the son's throne and kingdom. When David's son does wrong, God will punish him, but through human beings, not by supernatural means. While this royal theology appears in a few scattered places like Psalm 2 and Psalm 72, it remains a minor thread in the Hebrew Scriptures. What does appear to have happened is that the prophets expanded the metaphor from God as the father of the king, especially the Davidic one down in Jerusalem, to God as the father of Israel. Hosea 11:1, which may be the earliest surviving step in the process, reads, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." It was this later idea, of course, which was Jesus' favorite way of referring to God. But what, or more exactly, who, influenced Jesus' view of the kind of father God is? Because boys learn so much about how to be men from their fathers, I think it was Joseph, who usually rates barely a mention every year at Christmas. We're already told that Joseph went ahead with his marriage to Mary despite his misgivings because he was unwilling to make her a public example. In other words, Joseph was unwilling to see Mary stoned to death while she was pregnant. Instead, Joseph stepped up to the plate and raised Mary's child even if he wasn't the biological father. Jesus' well-known interactions with women, like the way he allowed Mary of Bethany to sit at his feet and listen to him teach, just like his male disciples, suggests that Joseph would listen to Mary's ideas and treat her as a human being, maybe even as an equal. That Jesus saw God as a benevolent Father who knows our needs before we even ask suggests that Joseph was attentive to the needs of his family and was proactive in meeting those needs rather than reactive, and so on. If you ask me, Joseph has never been given the credit he deserves, either for the man Jesus grew into or for his insights into the nature and character of God. Now, I know many people have or had fathers who were less than ideal, or worse. The metaphor of the fatherhood of God doesn't really speak to these people, or if they hear God spoken of exclusively as Father, the image is a stumbling block to them, or a source of unease, not comfort. Some in this age, informed by feminist concerns, simply feel that the speaking of God only as Father is part of the old pattern of automatically privileging the male, which is bad. All of this is understandable, and as I said earlier, there are numerous ways to describe our relationship with God. More than that, there aren't too many men in our small meeting who are fathers in either the biological sense or the legal sense. But that shouldn't keep all of us men from being fathers in a metaphoric sense, nor all of us, men and women, from being ready to nurture others, making full use of the abilities with which we've been blessed. Each of us has had or will have the opportunity to be a giant to a child or to the most childlike and vulnerable part of another person. Are we the kindly sort of giant, which used to remind Joyce and her brother of Cousin Breezy? Or are we the sort of giant Oscar Wilde wrote about, transformed by our encounters with Christ as seen in others? I certainly hope that we won't be the unfriendly and mean sort of giant which used to remind Joyce and her brother of their grandfather, but of course, as always, the choice is ours.